All right. Now that we've looked at the different pieces of evidence from things from biogeography to DNA to all of those things that we've discussed in other videos, we're going to move on now to where the origin of the current theory of evolution came from. Who put this evidence, these pieces all together, and kind of was one of the first to put it into a cohesive theory. Now, I will start this by saying, as soon as we say something like the theory of evolution, there are some common misconceptions that pop up automatically, and I want to just maybe address those really quickly. The first is the common use of the word theory. In normal everyday use, people say, I have a theory, to say I have a guess. I have a maybe kind of a thing. That's not what a scientific theory is. A scientific theory, something only becomes a scientific theory when all of the evidence fits. So a hypothesis would be like a really well-educated inference or a guess or something that was kind of plausible. It only becomes a theory when we say, yeah, everything we have found fits with this. Now it becomes a scientific theory. So this is not somebody's wild guess of what happened. This is what everything seems to fit and point at. So just keep that in mind. The second is that a lot of people have this really knee-jerk gut reaction when they hear the theory of evolution. It's a very polarizing thing to say. Many people believe, well, I can't believe in evolution because I also believe in God, or whatever your religious beliefs might be. Or someone on the other side might say, well, you can't believe in God because you believe in evolution. Like the two sides are fighting, saying if you believe this, you can't believe that, and if you believe that, you can't believe this. That's not the case. In fact, especially around here, where we're a predominantly Latter-day Saint community, that sometimes gets sent around. And I'll tell you this right now, there actually is no official church policy on or understanding of the theory of evolution. No statement of whether this is or isn't something that happened. Now, I'm not saying it did, and I'm not saying it didn't, but don't let anybody tell you, well, the church says this, because they don't. There's been many people who have opinions, and that's fine. Some of them are well-reasoned opinions, but it doesn't mean that this is complete. Like if you learn about this, you're somehow learning something that's against your religion. That's just not true. We really don't know what happened, and we don't really know for sure about a lot of things, but that shouldn't shake your faith. In my mind, personally, this fits with my faith. That's totally off topic, but I just want to get those out of the way. Don't feel like if you have a certain faith or a certain belief that you have to discount or disbelieve or somehow disprove this. I think, in my mind, these can fit together. That's a different topic. If you want to have questions about that, if you want to discuss that anymore, I would love to get into it more with you. Just let me know. But let's move on to just how this kind of theory came about. So switch over here. So the first one, we're just going to talk about a couple, and these are only a few of the highlights. This guy, Georges Louis Leclerc de Buffon. Go ahead, say that. Go ahead. He was one of the first ones to say that species could change over time. So to say, like, the dogs we have now may not be the dogs we have in the future. The woodpeckers are changing over time, whatever. So he was the first ones to see this change and to hypothesize or say, well, maybe if they're changing over time, maybe in the future that could even lead to new species that we don't have now as that change becomes more and more. Carl Linnaeus, he noticed that species were becoming hybrids, that you could take, for example, a species of either animal or plant, and you could cross this one with this one and get kind of something unique and different, and that maybe over time that could be leading to maybe not, I'm not sure if he was thinking new species, but at least variation, right? New appearances, and that could have come from looking at selective breeding of dogs, which we've already talked about, or plants. But it was all leading to this idea that, oh, animals can change, plants can change. The life on Earth is changing as time goes on for a variety of reasons. And this is Charles Darwin's grandfather. He was actually one of the first that we have documented anyway to really hypothesize that maybe life all came from one place. That there was one type of life form, and over really, really, really long periods of time, that form of life has changed into all of the species and things that we know now. All right, now the two that you really need to focus on though are these next two. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, and that's only his abbreviated name if you look in your notes. Jean-Baptiste Pierre-Antoine de Monnet, Chevalier de Lamarck. Say that one, I dare you. So you need to know Lamarck. We're just going to call him Lamarck. And then you need to know Darwin and how the two are very different in some of their beliefs and similar in some. So he was the first scientist to really put forward a theory that tied it all together to say, this is what I think is going on. But he had some beliefs that to us are going to seem very, very strange. Keep in mind, though, at the time, he was just trying to make all the pieces fit. All the evidences we've kind of looked at, other than they didn't have things like DNA and protein analysis. But the stuff he had, he was just trying to make it fit. Now, he's also mixing it with some other prevalent ideas that you may have heard of before. And one of them is called spontaneous generation. A common belief before was that life would just show up, that it had this will or a desire to be. And so if you, like a common example is if you left some wheat and a dirty sock in the corner, a mouse would come from that. Well, we know like maybe a mouse found your sock in the wheat and showed up, but they believed that life could just come from other life. And he also believed that those things, when they were alive, had this desire to be better or to change. And that desire, if they wanted something bad enough, they would change. Which seems strange to us. Like if I really want to be taller, I will grow, would be an example. So that's kind of a strange idea to us. But he believed that that's what would happen. Now, maybe not dramatically, like maybe if I really wanted to be tall or I needed to be tall to survive, I would grow just a little bit. But the second part of what he believed is called the inheritance of acquired characteristics. And an acquired trait is something that you worked for. You went out and got. Like for example, if you studied really hard in school and you got smarter, Lamarck, that's an acquired trait. Lamarck said that you would pass that trait on to your children. Like, if I'm smart, my offspring will be smart. Now, we know that if I'm smart, maybe I'm more likely to teach my kids. That might be passed on. But he's just saying, no, strictly just genetically. My kids will just automatically be smarter because I was smart. Or somebody who went to the gym. If you go to the gym and you work out and you get big muscles and whatever, then automatically your babies will just be born and they will be more buff because you worked out. To us, it seems a little bit silly, but that's kind of what he thought was happening. That if an organism was working for something and it wanted it bad enough, that they could change individually. That individually they could change, and then they could pass that change on to their offspring. Okay, that's Lamarck. He thought individuals could change, and they could pass it on to their offspring. That's kind of the big thing that you need to know with Lamarck. So the example there in your notes, so if a giraffe, this is how he described it. If a giraffe needed to reach high to get the leaves in the trees, then they would say a nervous fluid would flow into its neck. And it would eventually get a little bit longer, and then that would pass that trait on to its offspring, who would also try to reach a little higher, so the neck would get a little longer. That would get passed on to their offspring, and so on until you got something that maybe started as a horse turned into a giraffe. That was his idea. All right, now let's look at Darwin. Darwin has a weird past. He started off trying to find his place in life and really couldn't find a fit. He tried a couple of different things and it just wasn't working out for him. And so finally he got a job on a British survey ship. They were going to go to all these different islands and just survey, meaning get information, like maybe make maps. They were going to collect samples of different plants and animals that were there. And he was very interested in science and that kind of stuff, and so this seemed like a good fit. It was an adventure. He was going to go out and do this. So they leave on a 5-year expedition, and at each stop along the way, he's kind of in charge of collecting and preserving all of these samples and cataloging them, and so he spends a lot of time looking at the diversity of life from island to island and from continent to continent, and seeing some of the similarities and some of the differences. And so some of the observations are there in your notes. So, for example, the flora and the fauna, which just means the plants and the animal life, of different regions were different. So, like if you go to Australia, there's different plants and animals than if you go to North America. So he just noticed that. They were different. But he also noticed, and we've talked about this one before, that the fossils of extinct animals looked very similar to living ones. So like a fossilized armadillo that was massive was found on the same island where there were armadillos, just much smaller ones. He saw that finches and some of the animals on islands called the Galapagos were very similar to the ones on the west coast of South America, but they were very different from the ones in Africa. Even though they had finches, they were very closely related to these ones, or at least very similar and very different from the ones that were farther away. And he was also well acquainted with artificial selection because he had been doing breeding of pigeons and things like that. And they do it for like fancy pigeons, not the kind you'd see like in a park eating breadcrumbs, but different. They're weird. They're like fancy pigeons. Look them up. They're strange. And just like dog breeds and things like that. So he was used to artificial selection. He was used to species changing based on selection. And now he started to see this from island to island and from place to place. And he was trying to put all these pieces together. And he was also very well read. He'd read books and papers by people like Buffon and Linnaeus and Lyell and other scientists. And so all these ideas are rattling around in his head. And he's trying to make sense of what's going on here. All right. So he knew that Lamarck had already come up with this theory, and he knew a lot of the objections people had to it. And so he spent a lot of time as he was coming up with his own theory to not only just have an idea, but to say, well, I want to try to deal with all the problems with Lamarck's theory. Like, what are the gaps? What are the holes? What are the criticisms? And can I make it actually fit together in a way that somewhat makes sense? One of the key things is he read a paper by a guy named Thomas Malthus, who is a mathematician. And he did a paper on the fact that there are way too many offspring than can survive. And that goes for people and animal populations as well. You look at something that has 100 babies, not all of those can survive. And Darwin, when he read that, he thought, that makes sense. Like there's so many offspring, but only some of them can survive. And so the chances are the ones that do survive out of all these varied offspring that are all, slightly unique and different, maybe have some traits that give them an advantage. And if they have those traits that give them an advantage and they're the ones that survive, those are probably the ones that are going to be passed on to their offspring. And he started to think of that idea as maybe that's what's causing the change that I'm seeing. That's why I find a fossilized armadillo, giant armadillo, with this other armadillo, is maybe over this massive time frame between when these lived here, conditions changed and being small was an advantage. And if you were huge like this, you didn't survive. And so over time, this might be the great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather of this little armadillo over here. Now, he thought about all these ideas, but he was very hesitant to publish it. And he kind of had this idea in his head. He was starting to put it together. But because of the criticism and the way the world was then, he was very hesitant to put his idea out and actually subject himself to maybe that criticism and things like that. it wasn't until he meets another guy named Alfred Wallace. And Alfred Wallace had a very similar journey to Darwin's. He went on a ship and did the same thing. He collected a bunch of samples from different islands, but he'd kind of come to a lot of the same ideas as Darwin. You know, he'd noticed this variation. He'd noticed the change of species, that some of them were closely related and some seemed farther related. And he put it all together. And so he wrote to Darwin, and they started talking about their experiences. Now, Wallace's experience was a little bit different in that his ship sank. So all of his samples and all of his research that he'd done on his thing, their ship started on fire and he lost it all, ended up deserted on an island. He had a really bad experience, to put it mildly. But he still had all the ideas rattling around in his head. So he contacted Darwin, and Darwin realized that that Wallace and his ideas were basically coming to the same conclusions. So they both wrote a paper, and they were read together at the where was it? The Linnean Society. So it was one of England's really premier scientific organizations. They got together. They both read a paper of theirs talking about this. And really, it seems like they would be almost opponents of each other because they were kind of competing, but at least for the recognition. But they really were kind of friends, and they worked together on this theory. But in 1859, Darwin then publishes all of his work together, finally puts it out there, and it's the book that you may have heard of. It's called On the Origin of Species. And it was just Darwin's looking at all of this stuff and trying to put it together in something that for him answered all of the questions and the problems that the critics had with some of Lamarck's theories and other theories, and trying to make it all fit with what he saw and what he had found in the world around him. So at the bottom of your notes there's some observations, things he'd noticed, the key observations, and then his key inferences, meaning based on those observations, what he think that meant. So, observation 1, individuals within any species exhibit many inherited variations. If you go walk around anywhere and see a group of people, unless there's identical twins, they all look different. There's variations in height, in hair color, in skin tone, in curly and short hair. All of those things are different. Okay, that's the first one, and that's true of any population: dogs, cats, birds, trees, whatever. 2, every population produces far more offspring than can survive. So there's just too many things being born. 3, but populations tend to be stable. Even though there's too many being born, the number of any population tends to stay the same, which means that not all of those being born survive. So his inferences then were to say, well, if there's variation and not all of them can survive, then individuals of the same species are in a constant struggle to survive. If you've got 10 ducks on a pond and there's not enough food for those ducks, they're kind of competing to see who gets the food, who gets to survive, and who doesn't. Inference 2, individuals with more favorable variations are more likely to survive. So if there's a duck that's better at getting the food than the others, that one probably has a better chance of survival. If there's a duck or in that species that has a disadvantage, maybe it's a short duck and it can't reach some of the food or something like that, then that's going to be a disadvantage, right? So the chance of that trait being passed on is going to be lower. So inference 3 is talking about that. If you survived, you have a better chance of passing on your genes, the traits that helped you survive, and so those traits in the next generation should be more. If you didn't survive, then your traits probably didn't get passed on, or at least are much less likely to get passed on, and so in the next generation, that disadvantaged trait probably won't show up as much. Those are the key parts. 3 observations and 3 inferences that are kind of a main part of how Darwin came to his theory of evolution. Now I'm going to do a separate video that kind of demonstrates some of the differences too, but that covers the notes on everything you need to know about Lamarck and about Darwin. So if there's anything there that's unclear, if you want to reach out to me with anything else, feel free. I'd love to get in touch with you because I'm lonely. Otherwise, I'll see you on the next one.